One of Formula One's biggest current talents is George Russell, a driver that's achieved a lot in a short amount of time, whether that's winning plenty of karting championships or dominating when moving to the Formula cars, winning both the F2 and F3 championships in a row.
George Russell is the Formula 2 champion of 2018.
Watching George Russell grow as a driver has been amazing, and he's only getting better. But what makes his driving style unique to others, and how does it allow him to compete and even beat sometimes a 7-time world champion? We'll start the episode talking about how he started in Williams and how he had to adapt his driving style to a Mercedes that was completely different, and going from backmarker to podiums and wins. Before getting it started, I wanted to thank you guys for support as always on the channel. You guys are the best and the best community that I can ask for. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. It would mean a lot to me and push the channel further, so thank you for that. But let's get started with the Williams era for George Russell. George Russell's move to Formula 1 in 2019 had him start his career at a very broke Williams team. The team was financially struggling, and it really wasn't the Williams team of old. We always know Williams as a prestigious team, won plenty of championships, worked with plenty of different engine manufacturers, was raised by Frank Williams to be a beast of a team, and really, if you look at the statistics throughout the years, Williams is a legendary team, and that name will always stick to Formula 1. But in that time period, they were backmarkers. They had pretty much like no financial backing. At some points, the sponsors were even backing out before the season even started. And it seemed like the team was really going nowhere. So for George to succeed, he really had to stand out, especially against Robert Kubica, who's an outstanding driver, especially in his prime. Obviously, with the crash, things didn't really go his way, but that guy used to know how to drive a car very fast. It was at this team that George got the name Mr. Saturday. His qualifying pace was outstanding. Obviously, with the Williams car, the race pace was never there in the car, but he was doing his job and always putting the car where it didn't belong. Being able to do this against a veteran driver like Kubica showed that George Russell's talent was outstanding and that this guy could be a future world champion. He dominated in this Williams era both Kubica and the Canadian legend Latifi, and he figured out how to drive a very tricky Williams car. The Williams is known to be a very fast car in a straight line, but when you put it through the corners, it has pretty much no downforce due to a deficiency specifically in the rear end of the car and being weak to wind. George Russell was always trying to push this limit. He tried even in Mugello to push the Williams car kind of like the Mercedes, and he talks about that the transition from Williams to Mercedes was super tricky because you can't drive the car the exact same way you drive a Mercedes. And as I stated, in Mugello, you could specifically see how different the cars were, specifically through high-speed corners where you need the downforce. George tries going flat out in this corner. The Mercedes makes it easy. Regardless of hitting the apex perfectly, the car just didn't have that performance to begin with. The Williams team actually gives a great reference and the biggest difference between somebody like Alex and George while driving at Williams. They talk about that for Alex, the initial turn-in phase was super important for him, meaning that he was braking at pretty much the normal point of braking, but trying to carry more speed through the corner, so having that stability on the initial turn-in was super important. While George would be braking later and tried straight-lining the car to have a better exit that went to the strengths of the Williams. Both drivers have obviously gotten great performance out of it. Alex, since joining the team in 2022, has been outstanding. I even made a video because the way he drives the Williams is even different to how George drove it in his day. But George actually carried some of this experience from Williams to Mercedes, and then he made his signature style that's actually very recognizable to another legendary driver. The best way to describe George Russell's driving style is something similar to that of Mika Hakkinen. This is thanks to the way that he drives the car, straight line trajectories through the corners. As I stated before, George likes to go a bit deeper into the corner to then be able to pretty much V out the car and then straight line it to get the most out of the exit. He does a slight turn before making a big adjustment on his steering wheel and then hitting the throttle to get the most out of it. This specifically worked really well in Spa, where we saw his P2 in a Williams, which was just outstanding. But most recently in 2024, the Canada pole position he had, this type of style works really well there because you're able to V out of a lot of hairpins and corners in Canada. His style isn't too far off of something like Lewis. Now we know Lewis as the late braking king. George doesn't have that to him, but it drives the car much smoother to that of Lewis. He has a very minimalist driving style, and in this day and age, Formula 1 drivers pretty much from about 2014 to now, from this turbo hybrid era, they all drive in a very similar fashion. There's very little things that you have to point out, and there isn't big differences like we saw with Michael Schumacher or Senna in his day, or even that crazy driving style that Alonso had at some point. As I stated before, it's a bit smoother than that of Hamilton. There's one clean movement, and he doesn't just creep up to the apex like Lewis does through his late braking style. This definitely helps him a lot in qualifying, and it's why we've seen in 2024 and even 23 and 22 that George has had the upper hand on Lewis in the qualifying, but in the race, that's where Lewis has the experience and usually takes over. He does a great job over one lap at conserving those tires and really getting the most out of all the sectors 1, 2, and 3. While for Lewis, sometimes by the end of the lap, he struggles because of that late braking style, and just overall the Pirelli tires not being able to take the heat that Lewis is putting into him. George does do a lot of corner rotation and a lot of steering in the decisive first input. And because of this, from the apex onwards, if the car is sliding when on power, it doesn't hurt him as much as it would for Lewis from the late braking, because he's got less lateral G's going through that corner. So he's still accelerating and getting the most out of that straight line. This obviously comes with very strong self-confidence in the car. He must have built it up considering he drove a Williams, but he did state that it hurt him going into Mercedes in the beginning because he didn't know the limits of a Mercedes that was much better than the Williams. Obviously, George was coming in and thinking this was going to be a race-winning car, but he didn't get that. The only time he's had a race-winning car and it was genuinely the fastest was in 2020 in Secure when he had that one sub, and you saw what Mercedes did to him. You can tell that George Russell will be a future champion if he's driving the way that he is. Obviously, there still are those mistakes where he crashes, like we saw in Australia where Alonso ended up getting the blame, but that was a more George Russell incident. Singapore 23 was also another one to note. In Canada, he also lost it off the track a couple of times. But if you ask me my opinion on Lando, Leclerc, and George definitely has the most balls out of the three of them and takes the most risk. And when he is driving against these greats like Max or Lewis or Fernando, he's never afraid to go for a fight, which is something that I can appreciate from a driver. Through time and experience, and if he does stick at this team and ends up becoming the leader like it should have happened in 2022 if Lewis did leave and ended up grabbing that 8th, I do think George will be a future world champion. And these are the secrets to his driving style. As I said, him and Lewis are not too different, which is also why they're so close in qualifying in the race, and it makes it very fun to watch the Mercedes boys throughout the years. And it'll be very interesting to see who's the next teammate going up against George. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Please leave a like and subscribe. It would mean the world. And peace.